Rosie, my mum, and Nigel and Gus and our extended families, we're really happy and grateful to welcome you here for this short memorial for Dad. We're mostly here for the drink and the food, I appreciate that, but we've got just a few little talks we'd like to say just to commemorate Dad. There's photos of him over here on the wall as well if you haven't seen those. We're going to start off by Gus's children, Harper and Seamus, to speaking memories from Dad's brother, Tom, in the UK, and Tom and Eleanor and Alex are streaming from the UK. So memories from Tom and Eleanor and Alex. So Seamus and Harper.
Hi everyone, I'm Harper.
And I'm Seamus. We're Gus's two oldest children and Robin's grandkids.
And yeah, as Michael said, we'll be talking today on behalf of Tom, Eleanor and their eldest son, Alexander. So I'm going to start with a speech from Tom, Grandpa's brother. Robin was a rock to me in my first decade. This started from the earliest of times when I was a baby in my pram at Iffley Road in Oxford during the war. Robin, keen to promote my education, would lean over me and try and get me to say dive bomber. On a less martial note, he could always make me laugh even when I was feeling sorry for myself about something. This used to annoy me greatly as I wanted to indulge my self-pity. I would try not to laugh, but I would always eventually succumb. I cannot even remember having a proper quarrel with him. Later on, I developed a huge respect for Robin, both as a parent and as a human being. When we had a family holiday together in Cornwall in 1975 with our young families, I remember listening in awe as each night he made up gripping bedtime stories. Stories, needless to say, in which Michael, Nigel and Gus all featured heroically. My attempts at storytelling were always pathetic by comparison. Roll on 40 or so years, his sense of humour never left him. My son Alex recalls visiting him in Canberra when it happened to be Robin's birthday. The house was festooned with Staniers. The candles on the cake were duly blown out. Make a wish, said the family. Close your eyes and make a wish. Robin obligingly closed his eyes and then opened them. Oh, he said, you're all still here. How I wish Robin was still here.
When we got engaged, Robin sent a telegram saying, "Congratulations. Can you cook sausages?" Spot on. I have been cooking them ever since, but also as an example of Robin's humour and practicality. The only Stanier among his parents and brothers to know how to do anything practical at all. His visits were always special, initially for their rarity, later more common, but always because Robin was such good company and generous as well, bringing presents for the children and our grandchildren and buying wine and treats for us. An extra joy was when Rosie was able to accompany Robin on business trips and retirement days in a private capacity. How I miss the voice on the end of the telephone, always talking such good sense of what a situation we or the world was in. We have lots of other photos of him and his family, which remind us of how many happy reunions we had over the years. We also have the beautiful and moving painting by Peter Greenham of Robin aged 8, Tom aged 5, with their father Bob reading them a story in the Oxford home in Magdalen College School. Robin's last visit included a visit to a hospital where he grew up. Robin's last visit included a visit to a school where he grew up, and I realised what an achievement his life has been to make such a go of both his life in England and in Canberra, contributing so much to both places.
So that was from Eleanor, Tom's wife, and this is finally from Alexander, their eldest son. When we first came to visit you all in Canberra, we went out for a picnic. At the moment when the fruit bowl was presented, our two boys, who shied away from anything containing vitamin C, looked in disgust, and you could both see this. Immediately, Robin was leading the charge in this cherry stone spinning competition, and of course our two boys jumped straight in the lineup of competitors, boys in competitions. He was such a great leader and a great entertainer. Thank you.
For those who don't know me, I'm Gus. I'm Robin's youngest and most charming son. When we were talking about what we're going to do today, we sort of divided and conquered what we wanted to talk about, and I think I got the long straw because I got to talk about what Dad did to contribute to the community, to the groups he was in, just more broadly how he contributed. We were doing a bit of a brainstorm and we ended up with what was effectively a really long shopping list of all the things that Dad had done. And, you know, reading out a shopping list is pretty dull, so we'll get to the highlights of that later. What I wanted to talk about first was the qualities that Robin had as a man that made him such a passionate contributor and volunteer. So first of all, he was a very unselfish man. So, you know, I've known Dad my whole life, unsurprisingly. And in all that time, without trying to sound like it's hyperbole, I don't ever remember Dad making a selfish decision or even being thoughtless. He was really intelligent. He could read a situation really well. He would identify what needed to be done or what wasn't being done, and that enabled him to really step up when the time was right. He was very much without ego, so you know he would be happy to contribute whatever needed to be done, whether it was taking the lead and making something happen or doing all the dirty work and heavy lifting. He wouldn't mind whatever was required. He'd be happy to step in and do it without complaint. And most importantly, he was really engaged and really interested in a lot of things. So I'm honestly not at all interested in aeronautics, but my dad loved it, and even when he was talking to me, he had a twinkle in his eye when he would talk about anything that he was interested about. So to the shopping list, or not quite. When we were having a look at all the things we'd done, I kind of broke up the things he'd done into the areas because it identified the things that he was passionate about and the things that he really loved. So I think that's a good way to look at this. That gives a good indication of what Dad was like. So the first thing was education. So as Tom and Eleanor have already mentioned, Dad grew up in a school, and I think right through his life he had a real passion for education. So in 1978, whenever it was Mike started at Torrens, Dad joined the Torrens Primary School PM&C, and soon he was on the board, and then he was doing the same thing at Grammar, and all the way through our education, all 18 years cumulatively of it, he was part of the community, part of the fabric of the schools we were in. Once we'd finished school, he developed quite a skill set, and he took that with him. He thought that he could use that further, so he joined the Chapman Primary School Board, and he worked there for years contributing, and that's a place he had. You know, he didn't have any skin in that game, but he had the skills and knew that the community had to get involved, so he was happy to jump in and work with those guys as well. When he retired as well, one of the first things he did was volunteer at Questacon. So for more than 20 years, every Tuesday, Dad would pull on his purple shirt or his t-shirt with some bad science joke on it, and he would trottle off to Questacon where he would help school groups and kids, whoever. Like, I can't imagine how many kids he's dropped off that anti-gravity slide or talked to them about tectonic plates. Even within that group, I understand he took a leadership role because he felt like the volunteers didn't get the credit or the support that they needed at times. So he was happy to step up and work with Questacon and work with the volunteers to make sure that it was a really happy place for volunteers, and therefore the kids and the families who came along as well. As I've already mentioned, Dad was an aeronautical engineer. He had a long career in the public service, which Nigel's going to talk about shortly over there. He also did a lot of work outside of his work in that area. So he was a faithful servant to the Royal Aeronautical Society. He did that for many years, and I'm not exactly sure of the circumstances, but at some point through, I'm not sure what it was, but some sort of constitutional thing, he found that he was in this role that he hadn't really signed up for. It was a lot of work, it was a lot of responsibility, and he carried that out without complaining for years. Although actually I suspect he did complain, but maybe just to Mum. But he did the role, and he worked. He must have put in hundreds of hours every year into that society just to make sure that it happened. Controlling members, running elections, organising speakers, driving people around, whatever had to be done. He also took his knowledge around aeronautics and combined it with his passion for the environment, and took the opportunity to develop content and talks and deliver speeches about the impact of aeronautics on the environment. And he'd be happy to chew off anybody's ear who was interested in either one of those things. The next thing that Dad was really interested in was basically just the community and people. So going back to Torrens in the early days again, Dad was part of the Torrens Development Association, and as part of that he built the tennis courts at Torrens, which was part of certainly some epic battles in our family. And just for the record too, I'm still family champion at tennis. He helped build the community hall at the top just near the tennis courts, which is, you know, anyone who grew up in Torrens has probably been to a ballet lesson there, or a music lesson, or a birthday party. And also, for the record, amongst my brothers, I'm also the ballet family champion. Mike, Nigel and I were all pretty keen soccer players, and Dad, not a soccer person, a rugby man, was happy to get involved in that as well. So every week he'd turn up with his flag and whistles, and not quite knowing the rules, would be happy to referee games or run a line. He did, to his credit, go to the effort to get a qualification to become a referee, where he became, you know, quite good at it. Always a little bit too fair for my liking, but very good at it. Dad also used to run the Red Cross volunteering in Torrens. So that would mean he'd be looking for volunteers, helping with paperwork, collecting money, all that kind of thing. But, you know, volunteers sometimes hard to come by, so Dad would have done a lot of walking the streets, collecting money from people. So if you have lived in Torrens somewhere in the 90s, you probably had Dad knocking at your door at some point, asking you for a few coins. There's also the JP work. I'm not really sure what a JP does, but it kept Dad very busy for a long time. He used to rock off to the law courts. He'd have people come visit his home. He was happy to accommodate whatever it is someone who needs a JP needed from him. Dad really liked people. He was really attached to his group of mates that he affectionately called Dad's Army. I think they all called themselves Dad's Army. This is a people who I think had their origins back in the Department of Supply way back in the day. So those bunch of guys, and I think their friends, and then some of their friends and their family. So it was a bit of a loose conglomerate of people who had some sort of background. Dad really loved that group, and he worked really hard to support those people too. He would help them travel, he would help them turn up, he would organise events, he would do what it took to make sure that all of those men and women got the rewards of being part of that group and having that association. One of my favourite stories about Dad is to do with Harold Chandler. So Harold was a member of Dad's Army. I don't think he was Department of Supply, but he was a pilot in World War II. So he did have that military background, and Dad brought him into the fold, as I understand it, and I think Harold got a lot out of it, and he got a lot out of having Harold there as well. But what Dad discovered, I think through the Chandler family, was that Harold was entitled to a medal from the French government for the service he'd done in World War II, so 60 years earlier. But he found out that he hadn't been awarded that award. So with the Chandlers, Dad used his understanding of bureaucracy, he used his contacts, he used his tenacity to work with the Chandlers to make sure that Harold got that award. And I was talking about a twinkle in his eye. One of his happiest memories, I think, would be seeing Harold get recognition for something that he'd done 60, 70 years ago. It was really amazing and really personified what Dad was like in looking after people. So that's about a third of the shopping list, I think. There's a lot more, but I think what Dad would want people to come away with is that he understood that if you are lucky to be blessed with the talents that he's got, or even half the talents that he's got, it's important that everybody contributes to the communities and the groups you're in. And he really personified that. I think that I can see that in my brothers and my wife and the family and everyone in us, and I think it all comes from Robin. So I'm really proud of Dad for that, and I miss him a lot. And if everybody was as half as committed as he was to supporting the community, I think we'd be in a much better place. So thanks, Dad. Thank you.
I'm Nigel. I'm Dad's second son and actual family tennis and ballet champion. Gus, who is the family baldness champion, talked about Dad's extracurricular activities. I'm going to be talking about Dad's career. So Dad loved planes from a very early age, and it's no wonder He was born during one of the glamorous eras of aviation, when the first generation of supersonic jet planes was being built. Dad grew up in the UK, and one of his earliest memories is flying to the Channel Islands for a family holiday in a de Havilland Dragon Rapid. And another is seeing a new Hawker Hunter jet fighter as a school cadet. Dad had a scientific mind and did well enough at school to go on to study engineering science at Oxford University. His first vacation job was at English Electric in Stafford, a company which made large generators, and he spent time on the shop floor being teased by the workers for his Oxford education and being asked to fetch left-handed hammers. After graduating in 1960, Dad became an apprentice with Rolls-Royce in Derby on £500 a year. There he worked on the development of the RB168 military jet engine. Dad obviously enjoyed his life in Derby. Highlights included playing rugby, owning a Lambretta motor scooter, and then an Austin Healey Sprite, which he drove around the country, taking part in jet engine trials, feeling like a dashing young fighter pilot from World War II. By 1964, Rolls-Royce was in trouble, and Dad felt his social life was stagnating, so he applied for a job in Australia with the Department of Supply for double his salary and most importantly, a first-class air ticket to Melbourne. Rolls-Royce made a counter-offer with a job in Canada, but why would you want to live there? Dad liked Australia so much he stayed. He was hired to work on the Mirage project and worked with the Australian Aeronautical Research Laboratories in Avalon, designing and testing jet engines. The work was interesting, and he learnt a lot as part of a team that delivered 116 Mirage aircraft between 1964 and 1971. In Melbourne, Dad also worked on the Mackie trainer. After a year, he was promoted to Engineering Class 2 and then Engineer Class 3 for the big move to Canberra in 1968. He and Mum had a big party to celebrate his salary increase to £5,000. Dad and Mum felt they lost nothing in the move to Canberra. Professionally, it was Dad's chance to do interesting work in the central office of the powerful Department of Supply. One of his first tasks in Canberra was to manage the Nomad project. The Nomad was a twin-engine utility aircraft that I remember Dad always had a soft spot for. In 1978, Dad did a training course which took him to many parts of outback Australia, as well as to Sydney every week. Dad joined the Department of Defence in 1978, which by then had taken control over industry policy issues from the Department of Supply. Dad joined Tactical Fighter Project Officer as an Engineer Class 5 and began the long and difficult task of choosing a fighter plane to replace the Mirage and then acquiring them from the US. That plane turned out to be the F-18, which, apart from his family, I would say was a great love of Dad's life. The F-18 was certainly the project I most remember and associate with Dad's work. And even today, when anyone asks me what Dad did, I say he bought F-18s for the Air Force. As part of this project, Dad regularly travelled to the US, sometimes for 10 weeks at a time, and he even had a chance to fly in an F-18, which he remembered mostly for throwing up as soon as he returned to Earth. For his work, Dad was awarded the Australia Day Medallion in 1989 and a commendation from the Secretary of Defence in 1991. As the F-18 project wound down, Dad became involved in other projects, including more work on the Nomad project, as well as acquiring the Pilatus PC-9s from Switzerland. By 1990, Dad was director of the Tactical Fighter Project Office. This was a time when civilians were starting to do work that had traditionally been reserved for military staff, and as a civilian, Dad had to work hard to gain the trust and respect of the military staff. He felt fortunate to have the support of Air Vice Marshal Hans Rosa. Soon the scope of the work broadened to include electronic projects, and the number of staff working for Dad expanded to about 120 people, mostly military staff. In 1997, Dad retired from the Department of Defence and was presented with a commendation from the Chief of the Air Force. After retirement, he set up a consultancy and worked on a number of projects, including putting together the winning bid for Tiger ARH for Eurocopter. He was also heavily involved in the Royal Aeronautical Society, as Gus mentioned, and spent time thinking about how to make aviation more ecologically sustainable. When I think of Dad's career, I think he had the great good fortune of working hard at something worth doing. He was too modest to talk about his career. As kids, we never visited his office, and the only signs at home of what he did were models of planes on the bookcase and boring aviation industry magazines in the letterbox. As kids, I think we never realised how successful and how well respected and liked Dad was professionally. I think Dad's work colleagues saw in him the same qualities that made Dad such a great dad: modesty, integrity, honesty, confidence, kindness, and a great sense of humour. Dad never lost his fascination with flight or his love of planes. He was still reading about them from his sickbed not long before he died. I wonder what it was about that first generation of supersonic jet planes that drew Dad into a career as an aeronautical engineer. After all, those planes were loud, crude, dangerous, glamorous, inefficient, full of sleek curves, and I don't associate Dad with any of those qualities. But I think it was more the miracle of flight that fascinated Dad. He knew how the magic qualities of lift and drag combined to launch an aeroplane into flight at the start of some exciting journey. I think Dad had a few magical qualities of his own, and he certainly launched many into flight at the start of my exciting journey.
Hi, I'm Michael. I am the least charming of the Stanier brothers, but that's my burden to bear. So Dad was really excited to be a father. And on my last trip back to Canberra, he actually shared a letter that he'd written to his parents in Oxford, Bob and Maida, to let them know that I'd been born. So I'm going to read some bits of it for you. 16 Mulgrove Street, Elstonwick, Victoria, 3185, or 3185. Dear Mum and Dad, well, it all started on Friday morning about 6:30 when I woke up in bed and found Rosie was no longer with me. After some exploring, I found her in the sitting room reading a book and timing what she thought but wasn't quite sure were contractions. So I told her I thought the best thing to do would be for her to get us a cup of tea while I went back to bed to study Rosie's midwifery books and Dr. Spock to see if there are any descriptions of what Rosie should expect. And if so, should we A, not worry yet, B, go to hospital, or C, have been in hospital hours ago? Anyway, after a cup of tea and a go at the crossword, we decided Rosie's training and all our books were useless on this point, so we rang the hospital and they said to come in. Then the letter Dad starts to describe the drive in. After getting lost and me not remembering where the hospital was for a while, now, in our household, Dad was legendary for his U-turns. When I learned to drive, I actually thought the only way to arrive anywhere was to accelerate quickly past it and then turn around and kind of come back and finally arrive. So I feel like that's my key inheritance from Dad, actually. So we arrived in the hospital about 10 o'clock and Rosie was given a bed and officially admitted. Nothing happened. Everything had stopped. So Rosie and I stumped up and down the corridor and balcony to encourage things to start again, with me feeling slightly embarrassed because of all the curious glances we were getting from night-dressed women all over the place. Now, the get me a cup of tea thing aside, Dad and Mum were great partners in parenting from the very first, even before it was kind of more normal for dads to be so heavily involved. And this Dad walking up and down the hospital with Mum is a perfect example of this, and I'm going to say a bit more about that later. So, in the letter after describing my birth, Dad continues, Rosie looked terrific, pleased as punch about the whole thing, particularly that it was a boy. Anyway, we looked at Michael together and he looked at us, and we checked, and as far as we could see, everything was there. Which, contrary to rumours, is true, I have to say. Then suddenly Rosie was asleep, and Michael and I stared at each other for a while, summing each other up, until I wilted and couldn't stand his stare any longer. So went off for a cup of tea and home for a meal, a huge steak, 2 glasses of Burgundy, and a large cigar. And then rang up Oxford, Townsville, Hobart, Cairns, the assorted family. And actually it's really lovely because we've got a number of those people who Dad would have called. We've got Tom and Eleanor in London. We've got Joe and Sue coming from Hobart, cousins of Dad. And Prue, Mum's sister, is here with us as well. So we're able to kind of still experience that even now. And this is the bit I really love. Dad then goes on to describe the next few days of celebration. I then went off for a quick drink in a pub where a complete stranger came up to me and said, "I've got to tell somebody, I've just got engaged." So I told him that I just had a son, and we shook each other's hands and we bought each other beers. Next day, I had a sleep-in and potted around till 2 p.m. when I popped in to see a friend. And then at 3:45 saw Rosie and Michael again. 4:30 went off to see some other friends. 6:45 back to the hospital. And then at 9 o'clock went to Carols by Candlelight, which is an open-air concert attended by about 150,000 people, and to which everyone brings a candle. It was quite pleasant, but rather too crowded, a bit like a Wembley Cup final crowd. Today, which was Christmas Day, I went to church, saw Rosie, went for a swim, saw Rosie, sunbathed in a park, saw Rosie, and then came home to write this letter. Now I'm just going to say, there's a number of things in this letter I never saw my dad do. I never saw him order Mum to get him a cup of tea, go for a quick drink in a pub, buy a random stranger a beer, smoke a cigar, go to church, or sunbathe. None of those things ever existed in my life, so it was amazing to see this letter. The one thing I did see from my dad, though, for his whole life was his ongoing enthusiasm for his life and for Mum and for his sons. And really he was a great builder, just as Nigel and Gus have been talking about. I mean, he literally built things for us. You know, in our backyard he built a set of swings, and then he built a sand pit, which was honestly more like a litter box for the feral cats, but you know, it was a sand pit in theory. We had a soccer goal that stretched about 20 feet high in a doomed attempt to stop us kicking the ball over the neighbour's fence. And he built us toys as well. He bought these great trucks, which we kind of used as mini skateboards around the house, stilts, cannons, and the general bits and pieces required to be a superhero, such as shields. And actually, this is the shield that he built me all those years ago. We've got another 2 or 3 still in the house. But as well as building things with his hands, he really built other things as well. And I look at Nigel and Gus and me and I go, Dad really built our sense of self. You know, as Tom mentioned in his letter or his little piece that Harper read out, Dad told fantastic stories of Sir Michael, Sir Nigel and Sir Angus. We'd head off for adventures, outwitting the baddies using wit and some complicated engineering solution that we honestly didn't quite understand, but he got very excited about it. So we could literally see ourselves as the heroes of our own journeys here. And when we did actually head off on our own adventures into life, Dad was brilliant at standing on the sidelines and cheering us on. I mean, literally. You know, it was, my first soccer game was as the under-5s for the Melrose Soccer Club, and that was 50 years ago. And he's watched games ever since. He's watched me, and he's watched Nigel, and he's watched Gus, and he's watched Tilly. I don't think he's watched Harper play soccer, because Harper's not a soccer player, but he's watched Seamus and George and Hendy. Even in the last few months before he died, I went with him and Mum, and we went to Southland, the very same field where he'd seen me 50 years earlier, and watched Mossy play a game of soccer as well. I did the math. I figured he watched close to 1,000 soccer games of assorted Staniers playing over the 50 years where he watched soccer. Not to mention endless other concerts and performances put on by brothers and grandchildren. But I thought I'd come back to the very first line of the letter I read, when I woke up in bed and found Rosie was no longer with me. That is odd, because one of the things that you know about Mum and Dad is they were never like that. They were always together. Mum and Dad were brilliant partners for nearly 55 years. I mean, Dad was a wonderful dad, but that's really a meaningless statement without saying that Mum and Dad were wonderful parents. So much of what me and Nigel and Gus are testaments to Mum and Dad's love and care and support and encouragement. They were a really great team. So as a way of finishing the formal part of this memorial to Robin, could you please raise a glass or raise your hands or pretend to raise a glass and raise a toast to Robin and Rosie Stanier. To Robin and Rosie. Thank you everybody for coming. It's lovely to see you all. We're really touched that so many of you have shown up. There is wine and stuff to drink there, cups of tea, lots of food. So I hope you'll indulge in some of that before you head off. Thanks again.